and on a snow-covered roof, 4 hoofprints etched perfectly into the white. No one had been up there. No one could have. But the prints remained defying logic, time, and death. And the old man, he passed last night. On his chest, a horse medallion lost since 1974. And the smell of sunlit hay flooded the room. Some called it delusion. But then the whole town began to smell it. A spirit had returned not to haunt, but to keep a promise. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss an episode where each story takes you deeper into grief, grace, and the mysteries that bind human and animal souls across time. The wind swept gently across the open prairie, carrying with it the dry whisper of hay and the long sighs of tall grasses swaying beneath the late autumn sun. It was quiet in this part of Colorado, eerily so. The kind of silence that presses against the skin that seems to hold breath just before something breaks. Jacob sat by the window, his body sunken into the green corduroy armchair, like it had molded itself to him over decades. His eyes, once piercing, now dulled by time, fixed somewhere far beyond the frost-kissed glass. He wasn't watching the cattle fences or the bent, half-rotted fence post near the barn. He was looking further into a place unreachable by those who still lived in clocks and calendars. The clock on the wall ticked, but he didn't blink. A mug of tea sat cooling in his lap untouched. Inside the living room, the light hung gold and quiet filtered through heavy curtains and the dust that never truly settled in country homes. An old radio played softly from the kitchen. Something from a long time ago. Patsy Cline, maybe. It crackled like it anyway. And then it came. A sound. Subtle, not loud, not even certain. A distant whinny, just barely. Jacob's eyes flared open like a spark caught in dry kindling. His spine, once curved, straightened just enough to lift him forward. He inhaled through his nose, slow and trembling nostrils, flaring. He set the mug on the sill with a delicate care that surprised even himself. And then he stood. Not all at once, but steadily. Something in him had remembered how. Did you hear that his voice cracked like a dry reed? From the hallway footsteps. A man's. Confident, rushed work boots heavy on old floorboards. Dad. Michael's voice was soft, but edged with alarm. He came around the corner holding his phone, wearing his tired work flannel and that brow-furrowed look he always wore around his father now. It was the expression of a man constantly afraid something had just gone wrong or was about to. Dad, he repeated, what are you doing? Jacob had shuffled to the screen door, hands on the frame, eyes scanning the fields beyond the driveway. It's her, he whispered. She's come back. Who? Jacob's fingers curled tighter around the wood. Sarah. Michael exhaled sharply. Dad, there's no one out there. She came back. I heard her. His voice was urgent. She's close. Can't you smell it? Smell what? The hay. It's fresh. She only comes when the hay's fresh. Michael took a step closer, lowering his voice like one might with a startled deer. Dad, there's no hay. The barn's empty. You haven't had hay in decades. Jacob didn't respond. His eyes were welling now the way old eyes do when memory and body collide. He looked up at the sky like a man searching for a name he lost long ago. Behind them in the kitchen, Jacob's wife Evelyn had paused in the act of drying her hands. She leaned around the corner, her gaze meeting Michael's. They exchanged a look, a wordless tether of helpless understanding. I'll get his meds, she said softly. No, Jacob said sharper than before. Don't you touch those pills. Michael hesitated. His father's voice, though frail, carried something ancient in it. Command. Belief. Okay, he said softly. Okay. Jacob turned back toward the window. You can't hear it. But I can. I can smell her too. She was always wild, always hated being penned. You remember that? Michael didn't answer. Not because he didn't remember, but because he wasn't sure which memory his father was talking about. And because he didn't want to lie. She's been gone a long time, Dad, Michael said. You know that. Jacob's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with the kind of disbelief that grief breeds. Gone, he echoed. No, she's never gone. Just quiet. The wind outside kicked up, then rustling through the dry leaves in the gutter, stirring something unseen. A chill passed through the room. Jacob drew in a breath, and then he said it. Quiet, reverent. Muy cojo. What? Jacob closed his eyes. The hay, the smell, like the first summer we brought her home. July 74, before the fire, before everything. Michael's stomach tightened. That word fire still hung over this house, like smoke no wind had ever quite cleared. From across the room, Evelyn's voice came again. Jacob, sweetheart, come sit. You're overexerting. But Jacob shook his head. I'm not tired, he said. I'm waiting. For what? Jacob didn't answer. He just stared out the window again toward that stretch of open land that used to be a pasture, now overgrown and lonely. His lips moved barely, a whisper not meant for ears. Michael stepped forward gently, placing a hand on his father's arm. Jacob flinched. "Don't," he said, voice tight. "You'll scare her off." Michael sighed, his patience thinning, but not gone. "There's no horse, Dad." "There's always a horse," Jacob replied. "You just forgot how to see her." Michael withdrew his hand, then glanced at his mother. "He's getting worse," he said. Maybe she said. Or maybe he's just finally remembering. They let the silence settle between them, broken only by the distant sound of the wind dancing through dry fields. But then came something else. Not a sound this time. A scent. Michael froze. "Wait." Evelyn lifted her head too. "Do you smell that?" Jacob smiled, eyes still shut. "Muiko," he whispered again, and this time they both heard it. Felt it. As if the room had shifted into another time, as though memory had become atmosphere. Michael stepped toward the door, opened it. Nothing. Just the same driveway, the same dirt and gravel and wind. But the smell lingered. It filled the threshold like a ghost. Jacob took a step out barefoot on cold wood. "Where are you going?" Michael asked. "To meet her." "Dad, come on." But Jacob was already moving slow but sure. And as he did, something in the way he moved changed. He stood taller. His steps became purposeful. Not steady, but intentional. His shoulders relaxed, as though the years were falling off. Michael didn't stop him. Not yet. Jacob paused at the edge of the porch, lifted his face to the sky, and then quietly, under breath, "I promised her. I said I'd never forget. That she could run free. That she'd never burn." The words hung there, like prayer. Inside the house, Evelyn watched with tears in her eyes. Not of fear. Not even sadness. Recognition, because she remembered too. The summer of '74. The girl who rode without reins. The horse that vanished in fire. And the man who never stopped waiting for her to come back. The next morning, the kitchen smelled of burnt toast and frustration. Michael was at the stove, poking at scrambled eggs that had long since lost their fluff. He hadn't slept well. His father's strange behavior the day before, the whisper about a horse long dead. The conviction in his voice, the scent of hay no one could explain, had kept him restless. That and the dream. In it, he stood in the pasture behind the old barn, but it was on fire. And someone was calling from inside. Not screaming. Calling, like a whisper through smoke. He shook the thought. From behind him, Evelyn set the table. Her movements were slower these days, but still precise. Measured. Like a woman used to holding too much together for too long. The sound of shuffling feet echoed down the hallway. "Dad's up," Michael muttered. "I'll get his chair." "No, I got it." Jacob entered, hunched and bleary-eyed, but with a strange intensity, like he'd been dreaming too and hadn't quite returned. He stopped at the edge of the kitchen, stared blankly at Michael. "Morning, Dad," Michael said, moving toward him. But Jacob's expression didn't shift. Instead, he looked toward Evelyn, then to the dining table, then to the far wall where a faded photo of a chestnut mare hung in a thin frame. His lips parted. "Sarah." Michael froze. Jacob extended his hand, not to Michael, but toward the space between them, an invisible tether. "You came," Jacob whispered. "You're here." Michael's heart tightened. He looked at his mother. Evelyn's eyes had gone glossy. "No, Dad," Michael said carefully. "It's me. Michael. Your son." Jacob tilted his head, confused. He blinked hard, as if trying to reboot the vision. "Michael's not here," he said. "He left after the fire." "Dad," Michael said again, firmer now. But Jacob had already turned away, toward the photo. He reached out to it with both hands trembling and pressed his fingers against the glass. "You always hated the bridle?" he said, smiling faintly. "You were born to run." Evelyn quietly stepped forward and touched her husband's arm. "Come sit down, Jacob," she said softly. He allowed her to guide him, never taking his eyes off the photo. At the table, Jacob ate in silence. Michael barely touched his food. The air was dense with unspoken things. Halfway through the meal, Evelyn finally said it. "He's getting worse." Michael didn't answer. She tried again. "We have to start thinking seriously, Mike. About care. About safety." Michael leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "You mean the home?" "It's a facility," she corrected. "With people trained for this." He shook his head. "It's a warehouse for the forgotten. Have you been to those places? The smell of bleach and piss, fluorescent lights buzzing like flies. Staff too tired to pretend they care. Don't generalize." "I'm not. I'm remembering." Evelyn sighed. "He doesn't sleep. He wanders. He thinks the past is the present. That horse Sarah, he's been talking to her like she's alive." "He called me Sarah," Michael snapped. "His son called me a damn horse." Evelyn didn't flinch. Maybe that means something. Michael stared at her. "What?" She stood up, took the dishes to the sink. Maybe she was more than a horse. Maybe she was a part of him, We never knew. You sound like him. She turned her gaze sharper than he expected. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. Jacob, still at the table, had begun humming softly to himself. A low, rhythmic tune, one that seemed familiar, like a lullaby or a work song. Michael got up and left the kitchen. Out on the porch, he lit a cigarette. He didn't smoke often, but mornings like this demanded something to burn. Across the dirt road, the empty field looked pale under the morning sun. Weeds, brambles, patches of grass that once were pasture. He remembered riding through it as a kid. Not on Sarah, she was before his time, but on Daisy the farm horse they'd kept later. Gentle, slow, patient. He exhaled smoke in memory. The screen door creaked open behind him. "You look like a ghost," said a young voice. He turned. Lily, 18. Sharp as her mother, soft like her grandmother. She wore jeans torn at the knees and a hoodie from the University of Colorado. Her backpack slung over one shoulder. "You're up early," Michael said. "I heard yelling." He didn't correct her. Lily stepped beside him, following his gaze to the field. "What happened to this place?" she asked. Michael blew smoke. "It got old." Lily glanced back toward the house. "Grandpa okay?" Michael gave a half nod. "Depends on your definition." She didn't push, just stood there for a moment quiet. Then, "Do you think he remembers me?" Michael hesitated. "I think he remembers feelings, not names." Lily looked down. "That's fair. I don't think I ever really knew him either." Another pause. Then she said, "I saw his journals." Michael turned to her. "You what?" "In the attic, last summer. Mom let me go up there when I was looking for old photo slides. I found a box with notebooks and sketches." Michael's eyes narrowed. "Sketches? Horses," she said. "But not just drawings. Notes, observations, emotions. Like he was talking to them through the page." Michael didn't speak. "He loved them," Lily continued. "I mean really loved them. Not like a farmer loves his livestock. Like they were family." Michael flicked his cigarette away. "They were," he said. Inside the house, Jacob was napping in his chair. His breathing was shallow, but even. A small smile lingered on his lips. That night, rain drizzled against the roof, soft and constant, like a heartbeat. Michael lay awake in his old room, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Sarah, about what she meant to his father, about how a man could confuse his own son for a horse and yet smile like he'd found home again. Down the hall, a noise. He sat up. Footsteps. He rose, crept out, found the hallway dark except for the low glow from Jacob's room. He reached the door and pushed it open slowly. Jacob was sitting up, eyes wide, staring at the far wall. Michael stepped in. "Dad." Jacob didn't turn. "I promised her," he said. Michael stopped. "What?" Jacob's voice was hollow. "I said I'd let her run, that I'd never tie her down. But I lied. I kept her. For shows, for ribbons, for people to clap." His breathing was ragged now. Michael stepped closer. "Dad?" "I broke her," Jacob whispered. "And then I lost her. And then I forgot." He looked at his hands, like they belonged to someone else. But she didn't forget. She came back. I can feel her. She still waits for me. Michael swallowed hard. It was a long time ago. Jacob looked up at him, eyes lucid burning. "She remembers," he said, "even if you don't." Michael wanted to speak but couldn't. Outside the window, thunder rumbled low across the plains. The next morning, Lily stood in the attic dust, coating her sneakers. She opened the old box again. Inside, leather-bound journals, weathered sketchbooks, pencil drawings of a mare with eyes like fire. Notes in cursive. Lists. Descriptions of muscle structure, behavioral quirks, training sessions, memories. And one line scribbled again and again on the back page of the final notebook. "I owe her the wind." Lily touched the words. Her breath caught. She looked out the attic window toward the empty field. And then she knew what she had to do. The late afternoon sun warmed the dirt path behind the house, streaking gold through bare tree limbs. Lily walked beside her grandfather, slowly adjusting her pace to his unsteady shuffle. She held his arm gently, not to guide, just to anchor. Jacob's breath was shallow, but his eyes were alert, scanning the horizon like a man chasing something only he could see. "I used to ride out here every morning," he said, "before the heat set in. Just me and her. You ever hear hooves before the sun breaks? Sounds like thunder sneaking in sideways." Lily smiled softly. "No, Grandpa, I haven't." "Then you ain't lived yet." They reached the edge of the pasture, once a vibrant stretch of green, now sparse with weeded grass and dry brambles. Off to the side sat a forgotten mound of hay, old, discolored, weathered by years of neglect. Jacob stopped. His grip on Lily's arm tightened. "That's it," he whispered. She followed his gaze. "The last pile I ever stacked with my hands," he said. "We'd run out of baling wire. I remember cussing at the sun." He took a step forward, let go of Lily, and dropped to his knees with surprising force. He buried his hands into the hay, fingers trembling, and then he wept. Not the quiet kind. Not the tear that slips out like an afterthought. No, this was raw. Animal. Like something deep had ruptured, a sound from the soul. Lily knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "I'm sorry," he said through the sobs. "I never said goodbye." She held him tighter. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of dried grass and smoke. Suddenly, Jacob's eyes locked on something beyond her shoulder, beyond the world of now. She was there. Right there, he murmured. And just like that, the edges of the present unraveled. The flashback came not in words, but in fragments, sharp, vivid, and almost painful. Summer 1974. The sun had teeth that season. Heat like a bell jar pressed on every living thing. Jacob, 46, lean and weathered, stood in the training pen, a rope coiled in one hand, sweat dripping from his brow. Across from him, a wild mustang, muscled, spirited, unbroken. Her eyes were fire. She reared back, dust exploding from the earth beneath her hooves. The rope in Jacob's hand tensed, but he didn't pull. He waited, watched. "I'm not here to own you," he said softly. "Just to understand you." It took weeks. She kicked fences, snapped harnesses, bit through leather. But Jacob never raised a whip. He talked to her, slept near her pen, let her see him vulnerable, crying once, late at night, after burying his old dog. He named her Sarah. "She was smarter than most men I've met," he would say later. By September, she followed his whistle. By October, she danced under moonlight. And then came the fire. Jacob's journal recorded it in jagged, frantic pencil. "I smelled the smoke before I saw it. I ran. I screamed. She was inside. The door was barred. I couldn't get to her. I tried. God help me, I tried." The barn collapsed in front of him. He dug for hours with blistered hands, clawing through blackened wood and molten tack. When they pulled him away, he was cradling a piece of scorched bridle and a melted silver badge, the award Sarah had won in her first and only show. It went missing after that night. So did part of Jacob. Back in the present, Jacob stood now staring down at the crumbling haymound, as though it held Sarah's bones. Lily touched his shoulder gently. "I want to know more," she said. "I want to hear all of it." Jacob looked at her, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes, a clarity brief but piercing. "You need to talk to Will," he said. "Who's Will?" "He's the only one who didn't lie to me." They found Will that evening, at the edge of the reservation lands, near the base of the foothills. He lived in a modest cabin adorned with wind chimes, dream catchers, and wood carvings of mustangs, frozen in eternal gallop. Will opened the door before they could knock. His face was weathered leather. Long black hair streaked with gray, braided over one shoulder. Eyes sharp as crows. "Well," he said, "I was wondering when the ghosts would send you." He looked at Jacob. "Still limping on your guilt." Jacob gave a sad smile. "I came to remember." Will nodded slowly, stepping aside. Inside the cabin was cluttered but warm. The walls were lined with paintings of horses, everyone with eyes alive and knowing. Will poured tea, sat across from them, and stared at Jacob for a long time. "You never asked what Sarah meant," Will said. "Not to us. You thought she was just a horse." Jacob said nothing. "She came from our line," Will continued. "Free-born on land we once roamed without fences. She was spirit walker, some said. Carried memory in her blood." Jacob lowered his eyes. "I loved her." "You tamed her." "I wanted her safe." "You wanted her obedient." Jacob's breath caught. Will leaned in. "You broke a wild thing to fit the world's idea of control. And the world burned her for it." Silence. Lily watched, transfixed. "She chose you," Will said. "But you didn't choose her nature. You chose ribbons, shows, trophies. You made her perform when she just wanted to run." "She never told me," Jacob whispered. "She didn't need to." Will sat back, exhaling. "That fire," he said. "It wasn't an accident." Jacob flinched. Will nodded. She panicked. Knocked over a lantern. Trapped herself in a cage meant to display her. "A prison built in your name." The room went cold. Jacob's voice was hoarse. "Then why do I still feel her?" Will's eyes softened. "Because she waits." "For what?" "For you to make it right." Jacob shook his head. "I don't know how." Will stood, crossed the room, and opened a drawer. From it he took a cloth-wrapped bundle. He handed it to Jacob. Jacob unwrapped it slowly. Inside, the lost silver badge. Singed at the edges, her name etched faintly, Sarah, 1974. "I found it in the ash," Will said. "Figured one day you'd be ready." Jacob gripped the metal, his hands shaking. Will looked at him long and hard. "You've been forgetting things," he said. "Faces, names, dates." Jacob nodded slowly. "That's not disease," Will said. "It's the curse of a broken promise." Lily spoke for the first time. "Are you saying his Alzheimer's is punishment?" Will turned to her. "I'm saying memory is sacred. And when we betray what matters most, the mind buries it. Deep. Until it's ready to bleed." The wind howled against the windows, then a sudden surge of prairie breath as if something old and wild had passed through the room. Jacob clutched the metal to his chest, and he wept again, but this time not like a child, like a man who had seen truth, and finally let it in. Snow had begun to fall again, soft as regret, tracing its way through bare branches and settling like ash across the front lawn. Inside the farmhouse, the tension was heavier than the weather. Michael paced across the living room. His jaw clenched tight, hands buried in the pockets of his worn denim jacket. He paused at the fireplace, then turned to face Lily and his mother. "No," he said. "It's a bad idea." Lily didn't blink. "You didn't even let me finish." "I don't need to." "You're talking about taking him back there. To the old ranch." "Why? For what? It's a pile of rubble." "Exactly," she said, her voice sharp but not angry. "It's a place where everything broke. Maybe it's the only place it can come together again." Michael scoffed. "You think stepping into the ruins of his trauma is going to fix anything? You saw what happened last time he had a flashback. He almost passed out. You want him to collapse in a ghost town?" Evelyn sat quietly in her chair by the window, folding and unfolding a handkerchief. She watched the wind play with the snow, how it danced for no one. For no one's. He remembers that place, Lily pressed. More than he remembers this one. He remembers pain, Michael fired back. He remembers fire and failure. He doesn't even remember my name. But he remembers Sarah, Lily said, and the room stilled. Michael's breath caught, but he covered it with a shake of his head. "A horse, Lily. You're fighting for the memory of a horse." "She wasn't just a horse," Evelyn said softly. Both of them turned to look at her. "She was his mirror," she continued. "His promise, his undoing." Michael's voice dropped. "Mom, please, don't start." Evelyn set down the handkerchief. "You think I haven't watched your father disappear piece by piece over the years? You think I don't know what this is? I've lived it. I've buried parts of him while his body's still breathing. But I also know this, he was never more alive than when he talked about that ranch." Michael opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I know what you're afraid of," Evelyn said. "I am too. But if we wait, if we let fear sit in the driver's seat, it'll drive him straight into darkness." Lily stepped closer. "I'll take care of him. I'm not asking for a miracle. I'm asking for a chance." Michael looked from his daughter to his mother. Their eyes didn't plead. They challenged. They stood on conviction. He took a breath, exhaled slow. "Fine," he muttered. "One day, we leave at sunrise." Jacob hadn't spoken much that night. He sat in his room, eyes fixed on a spot on the wall where a hook used to hang. In his lap, he held the old medal Lily and Will had given him. His thumb moved over the scorched silver, like a man tracing scripture. When Evelyn entered to tell him about the trip, she expected confusion, resistance, maybe silence. But he looked at her, really looked, and nodded. "Back to the beginning," he whispered. She smiled, though her heart ached. "Yes, love. One more ride." The next morning broke in grayscale. The sun refused to shine. Snow fell in steady silence, blanketing the landscape in stillness. The SUV rolled slowly down the county road, tires crunching over the frost-bitten gravel. Inside, no one spoke. Michael drove his grip firm on the wheel. Beside him sat Evelyn, bundled in wool and memory. In the back, Lily rode with Jacob, her hand lightly resting on his. He didn't look out the window. He didn't need to. His memories were riding shotgun now. Fields passed them by like specters. Barns, half-collapsed silos rusting into the earth fences, broken by time and storms. And then came the ridge. Beyond it, the hollow where the ranch used to be. Michael slowed as the road dipped. He turned the corner. And there it was, what remained of it. The bones of the barn, charred timber and sagging beams, stood like a graveyard for promises. The training pen had been overtaken by brush, but you could still make out the circle. Ghost steps, ashes of movement. Michael parked the car and turned off the engine. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Jacob opened the door. The cold bit his cheeks, but he didn't shiver. He stepped out, stood on the crunching snow, and stared at the land as if he were seeing it with newborn eyes. Lily helped him down the slope. Michael followed reluctant. They stopped near what used to be the barn doors. Jacob's eyes glossed. "Right there," he said. "She used to wait for me every morning. Just stand there, never tied down, just waiting." The wind kicked up, tossing snow into spirals. Jacob took a step forward, and another. His legs trembled, but he moved with purpose. "Don't go too far," Michael called. But Jacob didn't answer. His eyes were locked on something invisible, something real to him. His hand lifted, fingers outstretched. "She's here," he whispered. "Can't you feel it?" Lily moved to his side, her own breath caught. Jacob knelt slowly. The snow crunched beneath him. He pressed his palm into the cold ground and closed his eyes. I buried it here, he murmured. The last time I saw her. Michael stepped forward. Buried what? Jacob didn't respond. His hand brushed across the snow, then to the dirt beneath, then a broken plank of wood, half buried beneath years of seasons. He pulled it aside. Beneath, wrapped in what used to be leather, soaked through with age and ash, was a halter. Scorched, twisted, but unmistakably hers. Jacob held it to his chest. And for the first time in years, he cried without shame. Back at the car, Evelyn stood watching the scene unfold, with a calm that came from something deeper than understanding acceptance. Michael came to her side. I didn't think this would mean anything. It meant everything, she said. He seems awake. He's in the only place he ever truly lived. Michael looked out toward his father, silhouetted against the ghost of a barn, holding a piece of a broken life, like it was treasure. Lily stood beside him, arms wrapped around his shoulders. Michael exhaled. You were right, he said. Evelyn smiled faintly. We don't get many chances to heal what's broken. When one comes, we have to take it. Inside the car on the drive back, Jacob didn't sleep. He stared out the window as the snow fell harder, now the world blurring into white and memory. But his eyes were clear, focused. His hand still curled around the halter, moved slowly across the dashboard, as if petting something unseen. Lily watched in silence. Do you see her? She asked gently. Jacob didn't turn. She's running, he whispered, across the field, wild again. He paused, like she was meant to. The SUV crunched to a stop at the crest of the old ridge, the windshield now fogged from the mix of breath and anticipation. Jacob's face was turned toward the left side of the glass, and for a long moment, he simply stared. No one said a word. Below them, like bones protruding from snow, lay the remnants of the old ranch. The main house had long since collapsed. Only the corner of its stone chimney still stood like a monolith to a life erased. But the barn, or what was left of it, remained a partial skeleton. Charred beams jutted from the ground like broken ribs, and the heavy scent of ash, dampened by snow, lingered in the air like grief that hadn't faded. Jacob opened the door before anyone else moved. His steps, though slow, carried an odd resolve. Each one seemed less like a movement of body and more like a pull from the past, as if the ground beneath him remembered him too. Lily followed quickly behind him, watching her grandfather walk as though drawn by some invisible compass. Evelyn remained at the top of the hill, her arms folded, her coat tight as if protecting more than just skin. Michael Silent walked last, his boots cracking the thin crust of ice with every step. At the edge of the ruined barn, Jacob paused. He turned to face a blackened doorway. The frame still stood, its top beam warped, the wood scorched dark. He raised his hand trembling and slowly reached forward, his palm hovering in the cold air. Lily stepped forward. What is it? Jacob didn't respond. His hand made a slow, deliberate motion downward, then along like brushing the length of something familiar. His fingers curled, almost cradling. She was right here, he said at last. Lily's breath caught. Every morning, he continued. She'd lean her head out, waiting, never tied, just waiting. Michael watched in silence, arms crossed tightly. Then, without warning, a gust of wind whipped through the remnants of the barn. It cut through the wood, danced over their skin. Lily flinched. Evelyn shivered. Even Michael reached for his coat collar. But Jacob inhaled, and then something shifted. Lily's eyes widened. Do you? Michael turned. What? She looked at him. The smell. He frowned. Then he caught it too. Not smoke, not mold, but hay. Dry, sun-scorched golden hay. It didn't make sense. There was no hay. The barn had been empty for decades, but the scent was there, undeniable. Jacob's eyes filled with tears. She's here. They didn't argue. No one spoke. The wind stilled, and Jacob stepped forward into the ruins. Inside, the skeleton of the barn revealed its wounds. Sections of collapsed roofing lay blanketed by snow. The wall to the left had given in to weather, and time the boards splintered and bowed. Jacob walked to the far corner. Michael moved as if to stop him, but Evelyn touched his arm. Let him. Jacob moved with increasing certainty, his boots crunching over snow-dusted debris, his fingers trailing along the air where walls once stood, stalls once held life. He paused in front of a collapsed door, a heavy wooden hatch with one rusted hinge still stubbornly attached. Beneath it, a soft rise in the ground suggested something buried. Jacob knelt, slow creaking, and brushed away the snow with his bare hands. His fingers found the wood beneath, then the warped iron handle. He tried lifting. It didn't budge. Michael stepped forward. Let me. Together they heaved. The hatch groaned, the earth resisting as if it too feared what lay beneath. Then with a cracking pop it gave. A gust of stale air emerged, cold and earthy like breath from a buried room. A stairwell descended, only 4 steps, enough to lead into the remnants of the feed room, the old grain store. Jacob descended without hesitation. The others followed, ducking beneath low beams, stepping over broken bags of seed that had turned to fossil. Inside it was dark and still. But Jacob moved like he knew exactly where to go. He stopped in front of a wall of shelving now half collapsed. He reached behind the lowest plank hand, searching the dust. Lily held her breath. Then he paused, fingers tightening around something, a sound metal on wood, and then he pulled. From behind the board, wrapped in brittle leather, was a necklace. The leather had cracked, but the metal emblem at its center gleamed faintly. A silver medallion, oval-shaped, etched with a horse mid-gallop surrounded by a laurel wreath. Below it, Sarah, 74. Lily's hand flew to her mouth. Michael froze. Even Evelyn, who had not stepped inside, could sense something had shifted. Jacob held it up to the narrow beam of light streaming through a crack in the wall. The emblem caught the light, reflected it, as if answering. Slowly, deliberately, Jacob placed it against his chest, both hands over it, eyes closed, and breathed. Long, deep. A tremor ran through him. Not weakness, release. The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of settling wood. Then Jacob opened his eyes and said, "She forgave me." No one knew what to say. He turned to Michael. "She waited," Jacob whispered. "All this time." And Michael, who had spent his life trying to patch holes his father never spoke of, saw for the first time not the man who forgot, but the man who remembered too much. He stepped forward. "Dad," he began, but the words caught, so he didn't speak. Instead, he knelt and hugged his father. Tight. Jacob's hands, still clutching the emblem, rose and rested on his son's back. Lily turned her face away to hide the tears. Evelyn stood at the barn's mouth, eyes glossy. Above them, snow continued to fall. But this time it felt more like blessing than burial. The night fell heavy over the prairie, the sky a pitch-black canvas, stretched tight with cold. The wind howled gently through the broken boards of the old farmhouse, slipping through every crack and whispering, through every memory still lingering in the bones of the place. Inside the back bedroom, Jacob lay on a cot, pulled into what used to be the den, a space now cleared of dust, stripped to essentials. An old quilt covered him to the waist. His eyes were open, unmoving, locked on the ceiling, as if watching something slowly descend. A single oil lamp burned near the window, its flicker casting long shadows that danced across the cracked plaster and faded wallpaper. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood, but underneath it, unmistakable now, was that scent. Hay, not the musty odor of an old barn. No, sun-warmed hay, fresh, alive. And this time, everyone smelled it. Lily sat beside him, cross-legged on a cushion near the bed. Michael stood near the wall, his arms folded, trying to mask his unease with silence. Evelyn sat in the doorway, not saying a word, eyes never leaving her husband's face. Outside, the wind fell still. Then, a sound, soft, rhythmic, hoofbeats. Jacob's eyes widened. Then another sound, a neigh, not imagined, real. It echoed through the beams, moved through the walls. Michael's mouth parted. Did anyone else? Lily looked at him. Yes. Evelyn stood up, slowly, walked over to the window, looked out into the dark. There was nothing, but there was everything. Jacob's lips moved dry, cracked. "Sarah," he whispered. "You came." The room felt smaller now, like breath was being held, like time had bent. He turned his head slowly, eyes finding Lily's. "Come closer." She leaned in. His hand reached from under the quilt, took hers, thin fingers clutching tight. "I have to tell you something," he said, voice barely a whisper. She nodded, tears already filling her eyes. "I wasn't brave." A pause. "I promised her freedom. Promised I'd never break her. I trained her with words, not whips. Let her run wild when the world said rein her in. But then, the bank came." Lily didn't blink. "They wanted the land. Said I needed income. I got scared. Scared I'd lose it all. So I made a deal. I signed her over. To the breeding circuit. Show horses. Controlled, polished, perfect." His grip tightened. She wasn't meant to be perfect. He swallowed hard, his voice cracking. She was meant to be free. Tears slipped from the corners of his eyes, ran down into his ears. The night they came to get her, she fought. Wouldn't load into the trailer. Kicked the ramp, knocked over a lantern. Straw caught fire. His chest heaved. She died in a place I promised would be sanctuary. The silence that followed was thick as smoke. Then he said, and I forgot. Everyone was still. Jacob looked toward the ceiling again, not all at once, but piece by piece. I forgot her breath, her eyes, her voice, until nothing was left but that smell. And even that only came at night. He closed his eyes. I betrayed the best part of me. Lily leaned in closer. You kept the promise. In the end. You remembered. No, he said, shaking his head. She remembered me. Evelyn crossed to the bed and sat beside him. She took his other hand. You're here now, she said. You brought her home. Jacob's chest rose with one final deep breath, and then he smiled, not with his mouth, but with his whole face. Peace. That rare kind of peace that only finds you when you've stood at the cliff edge of memory and chosen not to jump, but to fly. I'm ready, he whispered. To ride. And then, like a candle folding into itself, his body relaxed. Stillness. The kind that comes after truth. The kind that doesn't break, but binds. A moment passed. Then another. and then the wind stirred. Through the crack in the door it slipped into the room, not cold, not sharp, but warm, soft. A breath, a sigh, and in its wake hay. The smell was everywhere now. In the curtains, in the quilt, in their hair. Michael stepped backward, stunned. Lily began to cry, not from loss, but from something bigger. Something ancient and holy. Evelyn closed her eyes. Outside on the roof they heard it. 1 step. 2. Hooves on shingles. No mistake. No wind. No dream. Michael ran to the door, threw it open. Snow covered the roof in a smooth white layer, and across it, hoofprints. Clear, deep, fresh, leading to the chimney, then stopping. The wind lifted again, sending flakes swirling into the stars, and from somewhere just beyond the ridge, faint and fleeting, a neigh. Lily turned to her grandfather's body, now still beneath the quilt. She placed the silver emblem in his hands, folded his fingers over it, then leaned down and kissed his forehead. Ride free, she whispered. The light in the oil lamp flickered once, then burned steady, and the house, for the first time in years, felt full. The sun had not yet cleared the ridge when Michael stepped onto the porch, a mug of untouched coffee in his hands. The sky had the pale translucence of a morning, still deciding whether it would hold light or stay folded in mist. Silence wrapped the land in a hush that felt both sacred and suspended. Snow blanketed everything, smooth and silver white. He took a breath. The scent hit him before the cold did. Hay! Again, stronger now, more vivid. It clung to the air, not like memory, but presence. He turned his gaze upward almost without thought, drawn by something nameless in his chest. And then he froze. On the roof of the house, in a place untouched by footsteps, were prints. Hooves. 4. Distinct, heavy, pressed clearly into the thin dusting of snow on the cedar shingles. They led from the eastern edge of the roof, arched in a half-moon, toward the chimney, and vanished. Michael blinked once, twice, expecting illusion, expecting the tracks to shift under scrutiny. They didn't. He stepped off the porch into the snow, craning his neck, heart thudding loud enough to drown thought. Mom, he called, breath clouding. Evelyn stepped out behind him, coat barely thrown over her nightdress. What is it? He pointed. She followed his gaze upward. For a moment, nothing. Then, she saw. Her hand rose to her mouth. My God. Behind them, the door creaked again. Lily. She looked up and gasped. Are those? Yeah, Michael said softly. No one moved. No one explained. Because there was no explanation. There was only truth. And truth didn't ask permission to exist. Michael lowered his head, eyes wet before he realized they had blurred. He turned to Lily, and without a word, pulled her into his arms. Tight. Tighter than he ever had. Lily, startled, let herself be folded into him. Then Evelyn joined them. 3 bodies clutched in stillness. A grief no longer sharp but full, and strange, and beautiful. Jacob was gone, but something remained, something too alive for metaphor. Later that morning, word had traveled fast across the field and into town. Locals, ranchers, neighbors, even a few skeptics. They came up the hill in pickups on foot, wrapped in scarves and disbelief. The prints were still there, unspoiled. Hooves, exactly as described. Some stood back. Some took pictures. Others wept quietly, though none could say why. A child asked, did the horse fly up there? His mother, unable to answer, just held his hand tighter. And then, from the ridgeline, a figure appeared, walking slow, steady. Will. His coat flapped behind him like a flag in mourning. His boots left deep tracks as he crossed the snow-covered plain, his braid tied tighter than usual, eyes fixed on the house. He stopped a few yards away. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He saw the prints. He saw the people. And then his gaze settled on the family standing on the porch. He placed his palm flat over his heart, nodded once. She forgave him. He said aloud, voice calm, cutting through wind like a blade wrapped in silk. Everyone turned. Will looked up to the roof one last time, then under his breath, almost like prayer. She came back, just to lead him home. Michael met his gaze and nodded. The sky began to shift, not brighter, but warmer, as if the land long held in frost and sorrow had exhaled. Birds returned to the trees near the fence line, chirping. Wind moved differently now, less like a scream, more like a song. And all across the valley, wherever the breeze reached, people would later swear they smelled it. Hay, sunlit, new, alive. Even in town, miles away, shop owners stepped outside, pausing mid-sentence, mid-transaction, noses lifted like something ancient had awakened. Do you smell that? Someone said on Main Street. The butcher, wiping his hands on his apron, simply nodded. I haven't smelled that since I was a boy. At the high school, students paused during track practice. At the feed store, the clerk locked the register early, and out beyond the fields at the edge of the reservation line, a small group of elders stood in silence. Faces turned to the wind, listening, because they knew. Back at the farmhouse, Evelyn gathered Jacob's coat, the old one he used to wear when walking Sarah, and hung it gently by the door. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Tears were not the currency of belief. Lily opened one of Jacob's journals, laid it out on the table. On the first page, in faded ink, to remember is to release the soul. She closed it, placed a strand of horsehair beside it, found in the feed room days before, and lit a candle. Michael stepped outside again, looked to the sky. Still no sun, but more light than shadow. He touched the porch rail, then his heart, then closed his eyes. That night, after the people had gone, after the wind had stilled, and the hoofprints had faded softly beneath a fresh fall of snow, the family sat in silence near the fire. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say, only something to carry forward, forever. It began with a photo. Lily posted it 1 week after the funeral. A wide shot of the roof under morning light, fresh snow, unbroken, save for the impossible clarity of 4 hoofprints pressed into the white. No caption, just the image. Within hours, it spread. Some called it a trick, others a miracle. But for those who had ever known what it meant to lose an animal they'd loved, or worse, to lose that part of themselves that used to connect with animals, it wasn't a story. It was a signal. And they came, by the dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. They came in RVs and beat-up trucks with crates strapped to the roof on buses from states away. They brought stories in their eyes, old leashes in their pockets, fading photographs of dogs, cats, goats, birds, ferrets, and horses. Always horses. Some came just to see the barn. Others came to touch the feed room door where the medallion had been found. Some came in silence, tears slipping soundlessly down weathered cheeks. Some brought their children. Others brought nothing but grief. And Lily was there every day, barefoot in the field wind in her hair, greeting each one with the calm grace of someone who had walked through fire and now carried light. She created a page called The Return to Hayfield. In the description she wrote, "This place is not holy ground, but it is healed ground." And maybe that's even better. Within weeks, donations flooded in, not from corporations, from people. Small handwritten checks with notes. For Max, who waited at the door until the day I forgot him. For Ruby, the last good thing my mother and I ever shared. For me, so I can believe again. With the money, Lily and Evelyn began to restore the ranch, not as it was, but as it was meant to be. No flashy stables, no showgrounds. Just open fields, warm stalls, and love. They called it Sarah's Rest, a sanctuary for abandoned aging and unwanted animals, especially horses who had nowhere else to go. Michael sold the condo in Denver. Quit his corporate job. No grand farewell, no second thoughts. He drove home, unpacked his life, into a small room above the barn, and asked Lily where to begin. She handed him a rake. He smiled. It was the first real smile Lily had seen on him in years. By summer, the sanctuary pulsed with quiet life. Horses with scarred backs and cloudy eyes now galloped in the fields. Old donkeys brayed at the sun. A 3-legged dog named Pilot had taken up permanent residence under the front porch and barked at anyone who dared arrive without cookies. Lily held workshops on animal empathy. Michael repaired the fences with local volunteers. Evelyn brewed tea for guests and sang songs no one knew, but everyone needed to hear. And then came the children. It started with a busload from a foster center in Boulder. Most had never touched a horse before. Some had never seen one up close. At first they were scared, but then Lily brought out Patch, a chestnut gelding with one eye and the gentlest heart west of the Mississippi. One by one the children rode, not for ribbons, not for speed, but for trust and joy and something else. Something ancient, something wordless. By the end of that day, every child left with straw in their hair and silence in their bones, the good kind. The kind that says something sacred happened here. Michael stood at the edge of the field one evening, watching the children ride under a lavender sky. Evelyn sat on the porch steps behind him, humming a tune she hadn't sung since Jacob died. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded. "Tired, good tired." She smiled. "You look like your father." He turned surprised. "I do." She nodded slowly. "Not the man who forgot. The one who remembered." Michael looked down quiet. "Do you think he knew?" "Knew what?" "That it would become this." She shook her head. "I think he just wanted to keep a promise. The rest, that was Sarah's doing." That night, Lily updated the website again. She added a new line. "For every animal you forgot to say goodbye to, this place remembers." Below it, a video autoplayed children laughing, horses trotting the wind, catching the ribbon of a young girl's braid as she leaned into the neck of a golden mare. At the end, one frame held still. A shot of the sky above the barn. A breeze moved through, and in the silence that followed a soft sound. Not music, not narration, but a single clear whinny and the rustle of hay. The morning light spilled slowly across the pasture like gold melting over frost. The ranch was still but not empty. It was the stillness of reverence, not of absence. At the center of the main paddock stood the new stable rebuilt with care timber. Weathered from old barns donated by neighbors, painted a soft white that caught the dawn just right. At its front gate, hanging from 2 nails driven into cedar, was a sign carved by hand. Sarah, a free spirit. She reminded us a promise is a promise, even beyond the end. Lily stood in front of it now, fingertips grazing the edge of the lettering, her breath fogged in the chill air. The horses behind her stirred gently in their stalls. Somewhere down the pasture, children's voices were starting to rise, laughter, the kind that comes from connection rather than entertainment. But in this moment, Lily wasn't listening to the world. She was listening to what had been left behind. She closed her eyes, and there it was, again. That scent. Hay. Sun-warmed. Alive. Not overpowering. Just present. She tilted her head up, let the wind pass over her cheeks, into her hair. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too." Behind her, Michael approached slowly. He didn't interrupt. Just stood beside her, his hand resting gently on the top rail of the fence. "She'd have loved this," he said. Lily nodded. She made it possible. He smiled the kind of smile that knew what it cost to find peace. They stood together in silence. Then Lily took a breath, stepped back from the gate, and walked toward the barn's ladder. She climbed slowly, deliberately, each step like a word spoken in prayer. At the top, she reached the roof's edge. Snow had fallen lightly the night before, dusting the cedar shingles once again. She looked down. Nothing there, but she waited. And then, a gust. Gentle, and with it, the faintest impressions. Hoofprints. Just two. Not heavy, not defined, but there. Enough. Lily's eyes welled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she looked up. The camera begins to track with her gaze. Rising, gliding, leaving her on the rooftop, framed by sky and memory. It passes over the barn, over the chimney, over the trees, and upward still, into the morning sun that now blazes through the last edge of cloud. Then, a sound, faint, but clear, a whinny, not from earth, from sky, from soul, from wherever wind and memory and spirit converge. And then, fade to white, a breath, and silence. Emotional symbols throughout the story. Final resolution, the scent of hay. No longer just a memory, but a presence. An invisible bridge between human and horse, between the living world and free spirits. The hoofprints on the rooftop. Not something to be explained, but something to be believed. A sign that some promises even lost in forgetting will still be kept.